I'd already signed the papers. The buyer was standing in my driveway with the cash in his hand, and the engine of my late husband's truck growled one last time as if to mark the end of an era. That truck had been sitting in the garage for months, smelling of oil, dust, and memories I didn't want to carry anymore. I thought selling it would be the cleanest cut I could make, a way of breathing without feeling his ghost behind me every time I looked at that rusty hood. But just as I was about to hand over the keys, a woman I had never seen before appeared at the edge of the driveway. She was younger, confident in a way that pierced through the solemn quiet of my grief, and she looked straight at me with eyes that carried both sorrow and defiance. The buyer turned, confused, and I froze because the stranger's first words were not for him. They were for me, and they felt like shards of glass cutting the air between us. "You can't sell it. That truck belongs to me too." The silence that followed was unbearable, heavier than any funeral hush, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. She walked closer, her steps slow but unyielding, and with every step I felt my hands trembling more around those keys. My husband's voice echoed faintly in my head, a memory of him laughing while polishing that very truck, a memory I once cherished but now felt tainted. The woman stopped just inches from me, her perfume foreign yet suddenly intimate, and she whispered in a tone that left the buyer speechless. I was his mistress. And that truck hides more of him than you ever knew. My breath caught in my chest. My grief turned raw and jagged. And I realized that this was not the end of a chapter. It was the opening line of a story I never asked to live. The night after she appeared, I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at the untouched dinner that had gone cold hours before, the silence of the house pressing against me in a way that no silence ever had before. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the old wall clock, even the wind rattling the branches outside the window. All of it seemed to swell into a symphony of absence, as if the walls themselves wanted to remind me of how empty the world had become since his death. For months I had tried to adjust to this emptiness by creating a kind of fragile order. Morning coffee at the same time. Chores lined up like a soldier's duty. The television left on even when I wasn't watching, just to give the illusion of a pulse inside these rooms. And in that order, the truck had become more than a vehicle parked in the garage. It was a silent beast waiting, holding the smell of gasoline and sweat, the echo of his laughter when he would rev the engine, the clink of tools he always left scattered across the workbench. Every time I passed by it, I felt a pang like a knife between my ribs, but I told myself it was just an object, nothing more, nothing sacred. That's why selling it seemed logical, almost merciful, like removing a bandage that had been stuck too long. But now, after the words of that woman, logic had evaporated, and I found myself staring at my plate of untouched food, wondering if the truck was a tomb I had never dared to open, and if my husband had left more ghosts inside than the one I had been mourning. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it arrived like a cruel joke, filled with dreams that felt too vivid to be dismissed at sunrise. I dreamed of him behind the wheel, his hand tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with a song I could not hear, his eyes glancing at the passenger seat with a smile that did not belong to me. In the dream, I followed his gaze, and sitting there was the woman, her hair falling over her shoulders, her lips curved in satisfaction, her hand resting on his thigh as if it had always belonged there. I woke up gasping, clutching the sheets as though they were the only anchor to reality, but the dream left behind a residue, a sour taste of betrayal that clung to me throughout the morning. When I poured coffee into my mug, the steam rising like smoke from an invisible fire, I felt that same bitterness coating my throat, forcing me to accept what I had heard the day before. My husband had not been mine alone. That truck, the one I thought of as the last physical tie to him, was also tied to her, perhaps even more intimately than I wanted to imagine. It was not just the thought of infidelity that haunted me. It was the realization that my grief had been shared without my consent, that every tear I had shed in solitude might have been mirrored by hers in secret, creating a parallel world of mourning I had been blind to until she walked into my driveway. As the morning light crept into the kitchen, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the air, I forced myself to confront the reality I had been avoiding. I pulled out the old folder where I kept every bill, every insurance paper, every document that carried his name, and spread them across the table like tarot cards laid out for a reading. Receipts for oil changes, warranty slips for tires, handwritten notes reminding him to pick up parts from the hardware store. All of it stared back at me, tangible proof of a life that had seemed steady, honest, even predictable. And yet, hidden in the folds of these papers, I began to notice gaps, small irregularities that I had overlooked before, dates that didn't align, purchases that didn't make sense, miles recorded on receipts that suggested trips he never mentioned. It was like staring at a puzzle I had thought was complete, only to realize entire pieces were missing, swallowed by some shadow I had never dared to chase. The more I looked, the more I felt my throat tightening, and I realized that the truck wasn't just a reminder of him. It was a vessel of his secrets, a rolling archive of places he had gone, people he had seen, lies he had told. And now, whether I wanted to or not, I had been forced to inherit those secrets, dragged into a truth I had never asked to uncover. I left the papers on the table and walked into the garage, the air thick with the sharp tang of oil and rubber, the floor littered with stains that refused to fade no matter how many times I had scrubbed them. The truck sat there, hulking in the shadows, its paint dulled with years but still carrying a stubborn pride, as if it dared me to confront it. I ran my hand along the side, feeling the roughness of scratches I never noticed, the dents that spoke of stories I had never been told. When I opened the driver's side door, the familiar creak echoed in the space, and the smell of him rushed out. Leather, cologne, sweat, a faint trace of cigarettes he had promised me he quit. I sat in the driver's seat, the silence pressing against my ears, and stared at the dashboard. It felt like trespassing, like I had stepped into a world that had never fully belonged to me. The glove compartment, the center console, even the small crevices where dust gathered. They all whispered of a life lived in parallel, a narrative stitched together with threads I had never been allowed to see. And as much as I wanted to slam the door shut and retreat back to the safety of ignorance, something in me refused. I needed to know what the mistress meant when she said the truck hid more of him. Her words replayed in my head all day, looping like a haunting chorus. That truck belongs to me too. I wanted to dismiss her as a liar, an intruder trying to wound me when I was already fragile. But the certainty in her voice had been unshakable. She hadn't pleaded or begged, hadn't even raised her tone. She had simply declared it, as though she were stating a fact as undeniable as the color of the sky. And that confidence was what gnawed at me, what gave her the right to speak with such ownership over something that had been part of my marriage, part of my grief. Unless, of course, she truly knew the truck in ways I didn't. I remembered the way she had looked at it, not with curiosity, but with recognition, with a familiarity that chilled me. She hadn't just known of the truck. She had memories with it, imprints of her presence woven into its very frame. I pictured them together, laughing inside the cabin, driving down roads I had never traveled with him, creating moments that now felt stolen from me. And though anger rose hot in my chest, burning me from within, I couldn't escape the truth. Her claim had weight, and I had no choice but to confront it. Later that afternoon, I picked up the phone and called my sister, the only person I trusted enough to bear this raw wound to. Her voice came through the line soft and steady, but when I told her about the mistress, about the truck, about the claim that shook me to my core, she fell into silence that lasted too long. Finally, she said what I feared most. Maybe you should hear her out. The suggestion felt like betrayal, like my own blood had taken the side of the stranger who had invaded my grief. But deep down, I knew my sister wasn't wrong. If I ignored this, if I sold the truck without answers, I would carry the weight of not knowing for the rest of my life, and the not knowing was already hollowing me out. My sister urged me to tread carefully, to protect myself, but the seed had already been planted. Curiosity wrapped in anger, grief tangled with suspicion. I hung up the phone and sat in the living room, staring at the empty chair where he used to sit, and realized I couldn't just close this chapter. The story had been cracked open, and whether I liked it or not, I had to read the next page. That evening, I walked through the neighborhood, the crisp air biting my cheeks, the familiar houses glowing with warm light through their windows. From the outside, everything looked normal, ordinary. the kind of life I had once believed was mine as well. Couples eating dinner together, children's laughter spilling onto the streets, dogs barking from fenced yards, all reminders of a stability I no longer possessed. As I walked, I thought about how little we really know the people closest to us, how easy it is to believe in the version they show us, the version we want to see. My husband had been my anchor, my partner, my confidant, or so I thought. But now, with one sentence from a stranger, that entire foundation had cracked. I felt as though I had been living in a house built on sand, and the tide had finally come to swallow it whole. By the time I returned home, the night sky heavy with stars that seemed indifferent to my turmoil, I knew there was no escaping what lay ahead. The truck wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a question I needed answered, a wound that demanded to be examined no matter how deep it cut. When I finally sat back down in the garage, staring at the truck under the dim light of a single bulb, I realized I wasn't afraid of the truth itself. I was afraid of what it would do to me. Would it shatter the memories I had clung to? Or would it free me from the illusions I hadn't even known I was carrying? I brushed my hand over the steering wheel, my fingers tracing the grooves worn by his grip, and I felt the ghost of him linger there. It was almost like touching his absence, a cruel imitation of intimacy. And in that moment, I made a decision that surprised me even as I spoke it aloud into the empty garage. I will find out. The words echoed, bouncing off the walls, settling into the silence as a vow. I didn't know if I would search alone, or if I would confront the mistress again, or if I would dig through every hidden corner of that truck until the answers revealed themselves. But I knew I couldn't remain still, couldn't remain ignorant. My grief had already been poisoned with betrayal, and the only antidote was truth. And so, the next day I stood at the driveway once more, staring at the truck with new eyes, no longer as a widow trying to rid herself of a relic, but as a woman standing at the threshold of discovery. The buyer never returned, perhaps sensing the storm that had gathered around me, perhaps warned away by the scene he had witnessed. It didn't matter. The sale was no longer the point. This was no longer about money or closure or even survival. This was about reclaiming a narrative that had been stolen from me, about piecing together the life of a man who had loved me and betrayed me in equal measure. The mistress's words still rang in my ears, sharp and undeniable. But instead of paralyzing me, they now pushed me forward. Whatever secrets that truck carried, I would face them. Whatever truths lay buried in its steel frame, I would unearth them. And though fear coiled in my stomach, I stepped closer, knowing that this was just the beginning, and that every answer would come with a price I wasn't sure I was ready to pay. I woke the next morning with a kind of restlessness that felt more like possession than simple unease. As though the truck itself had entered my bloodstream, demanding to be understood, demanding that I finally look at it not as an object but as a message. The sky outside was pale and washed, the air thick with the smell of impending rain, and my body moved almost without thought, pulling me to the garage as if something were waiting inside. When I opened the door, the coldness of the metal handle stung my palm, and the truck loomed in the dimness like a sentinel guarding truths I was not yet ready to confront. I slipped into the driver's seat once more, the seatbelt brushing against my arm like a reminder of his presence, and for the first time I opened the glove compartment with intent rather than idle curiosity. A small pile of receipts spilled out, folded and worn at the edges, and beneath them I found something that made my breath seize. A photograph of him with her. The mistress, both of them leaning against the hood of this very truck, her hand on his chest, his smile wide and careless in a way I had not seen in years. My fingers shook as I held the picture closer, my stomach clenching at the undeniable proof that she hadn't come to my driveway with empty words. She had known him, not as a secret whispered in shadows, but openly enough to be captured in a photograph that he had kept, deliberately, inside the truck I had shared with him for decades. It was not just betrayal, it was history rewritten, and I was standing in its ruins. The image burned into my mind long after I slipped it back into the glove box, and I sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring at the windshield as though it might reveal more. Memories collided in my head. Road trips where he had reached across to squeeze my hand, the times he had told me the truck was his sanctuary, his excuse to leave the house when arguments became too heavy. I had believed he was driving alone, clearing his thoughts on long, open roads, But now I wondered if he had been carrying her laughter in that passenger seat, filling the air with stories I had never heard. My grief began to twist, curling into something darker, something jagged that gnawed at the very edges of my chest. I wanted to scream, to hurl the photograph into the fire, to erase it before it stained me any further. But even as rage seared through me, another part of me needed more. One photograph was not enough to explain the magnitude of deception. It was only the beginning, a whisper of something larger. And that was when I noticed the small key taped beneath the steering column, hidden but not so carefully that it could not be found. My pulse hammered as I pried it loose, the sharp edges cutting into my fingertips, and I knew with a dreadful certainty that whatever it unlocked, it would drag me deeper into his double life, a life I was now compelled to follow no matter how much it hurt. By the afternoon, I found myself at a storage facility on the outskirts of town, the key heavy in my pocket, the mistress's words still echoing like a curse. The building was gray, the corridors narrow and lined with identical doors that stretched endlessly like a mausoleum for forgotten lives. I walked slowly, my shoes clicking against the concrete floor, until I reached the number scratched onto a scrap of paper I had found in the truck's ashtray. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock, the sound of metal turning against metal louder than my own breath. And when the door creaked open, the stale air of the unit poured over me. Inside were boxes stacked to the ceiling, some labeled, others bare, but all of them carrying his handwriting, his imprint. I stepped inside, my chest tight, and pulled open the nearest box. What I found was not the relics of a secret romance, as I had expected, but something stranger, heavier. Envelopes filled with money, receipts for transactions I could not understand, ledgers with numbers that seemed endless. It was not just infidelity I was uncovering. It was deception on a scale that made my knees weak, betrayal that went beyond the heart into something colder, almost criminal. And as I clutched the papers to my chest, the truth crashed over me in a wave so merciless I nearly staggered. I had never truly known the man I had married, and every mile he had driven in that truck had carried not just lies of the flesh, but lies of the soul. I stood there for what felt like hours, the fluorescent light flickering overhead, the silence suffocating. The walls of the storage unit seemed to close in, pressing me to accept that the life I had been mourning was an illusion, a story carefully curated to keep me blind. Anger throbbed in my temples, hot and dizzying, but behind it was a hollow ache that felt far worse. The knowledge that I had loved a ghost, that the man who had held me at night, who had whispered promises into my hair, had belonged to someone else as much as he had belonged to me. My hands shook as I shoved the papers back into the box, unable to bear their weight any longer. And in that moment, I realized the mistress had not come to me out of cruelty. She had come because she knew this world of secrets too, because she carried her own share of his deceit, and perhaps she believed I deserved to see it with my own eyes. For a flicker of a moment, I almost hated her less, because in this strange, brutal way, she was the only other person who knew what it felt like to be tethered to him, and to be betrayed by him. When I locked the storage unit again and stepped out into the gray afternoon, the air felt different, sharper, like glass against my skin. I walked back to my car with the photograph burning in my pocket, and the weight of the ledgers pressing against my chest, and I knew that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. The truck was no longer just a relic of a marriage cut short by death. It was the key to a life I had never been allowed to see, and as much as I wanted to run from it, to bury the photograph and burn the ledgers, I couldn't. The truth had already rooted itself inside me, clawing at me until I would be forced to unearth every last piece of it. When I started the engine and drove away, the road stretching out before me felt foreign, threatening, and I realized I was no longer just a widow mourning her husband. I was a woman standing at the threshold of revelation, and behind me, in the echo of that storage unit, the ghost of my husband's lies was calling me deeper into the darkness he had left behind. The night bled into morning without my realizing it, my eyes refusing to close, my mind replaying the photograph and the papers in a cycle that left me hollow. By dawn, the world outside my window looked washed out and fragile, but I was anything but fragile. Rage and grief braided themselves into a rope that tightened around my chest, pulling me forward into something I didn't recognize as strength, but couldn't deny as momentum. I brewed coffee that tasted like ashes, its heat doing nothing to thaw the cold inside me, and when I finally stepped outside, the air was damp and sour, promising rain. The truck waited in the driveway, its body glistening faintly with dew, and I saw it then for what it truly was. Not an heirloom, not a burden, but a stage where truths had been rehearsed and lies had been played out in full. I thought of the mistress's claim, of the way she had stood so calmly as if daring me to reject her truth, and a pulse of defiance spread through me. If she believed the truck belonged to her as much as to me, then she would face me there in its shadow, under the weight of all the stories hidden within its steel. I dialed her number that afternoon, my voice steadier than I expected when she answered. She didn't sound surprised. If anything, she seemed to have been waiting, as though she knew the discoveries I had made would force me to seek her out. We agreed to meet, not in some cafe or neutral ground, but at my house, where the truck sat like a witness to our fractured lives. By the time she arrived, the sky had broken open, rain pouring down in sheets that hammered against the roof, soaking her hair until it clung to her face in dark ribbons. She walked toward me with the same certainty as before, but I could see now that her eyes held something deeper than defiance. There was grief there, too, grief shaped differently than mine, but no less sharp. We stood in silence for a long moment, the rain drenching us both, until I opened the garage door and gestured for her to step inside. The truck loomed between us, its presence heavy, and I finally spoke, my voice cracked but unyielding. "Show me what you know." She didn't hesitate. With a familiarity that made my stomach twist, she slipped into the passenger seat, her hand gliding over the dashboard as if she had done it 100 times before. She pulled open the visor above her head, and from it fell a small folded note, yellowed with time. She handed it to me without a word. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, recognizing his handwriting instantly. The note was short, a series of dates and initials, nothing more, but I knew what it meant. They weren't random. They matched the gaps I had seen in his receipts, the nights he had told me he was working late or meeting old friends. Proof, in ink, that his absences had been orchestrated, not accidental. The walls of the garage seemed to close in on me, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth and oil. She watched me silently, her face pale and unreadable, but her silence spoke volumes. She had known this world of his, had lived inside it, had been marked by it just as I had. We argued then, our words sharp and raw, crashing against each other like waves in a storm. I accused her of stealing him, of invading a life that had been mine first, of poisoning the love I had carried for decades. She countered with a voice that cracked in places, telling me that he had come to her long after cracks had already formed, that she hadn't stolen anything but had accepted the scraps he offered. The rain outside pounded harder, thunder shaking the air as though nature itself wanted to underscore our fury. Yet, beneath the rage, I felt a strange recognition. We were two women mourning the same man, but not the same version of him. She had known his laughter in ways I had not heard in years, his touch in seasons when he had grown distant from me. And though it broke me to admit it, she had a claim to her grief too. That acknowledgement didn't soften me, but it sharpened the truth. The betrayal was larger than both of us, and the truck was the stage where we were forced to see it. By the time the storm eased, our voices had grown hoarse, our arguments burned down to embers. I slumped against the workbench, my hair plastered to my forehead, my hands covered in grease from gripping the truck's edges as though it could anchor me. She sat in the passenger seat still, her eyes fixed on the floor, and for a long while, neither of us spoke. The quiet was not peace. It was exhaustion, the hollow silence of two people who had run out of words. I thought of the storage unit, of the ledgers and the envelopes, of the proof that his lies had gone far deeper than just love divided, and for the first time, I wondered aloud if she had seen any of it, if she had known about the money, the hidden world of transactions and numbers. Her eyes lifted, wide and startled, and I knew immediately that she hadn't. Whatever truths I had uncovered, they were new to her too, and in that moment, the distance between us shifted. We were no longer adversaries locked in battle. We were two victims of the same deception, each of us holding pieces of a puzzle too large to solve alone. The days that followed blurred into a haze of uneasy cooperation. She returned more than once, each time bringing fragments of her own memories, stories that painted a picture of him I barely recognized. She told me of trips they had taken in the truck, short drives to nowhere in particular, evenings where he had spoken of wanting to escape the weight of expectations, of needing air he couldn't breathe at home. I hated her for telling me, yet I clung to her words, needing them even as they cut into me. I told her about the ledgers, about the storage unit, about the key I had found taped beneath the steering column, and I saw the shock ripple through her face. Whatever else he had shared with her, he had not shared that, and in her surprise, I saw the cracks of betrayal mirrored in her. The same wound that had hollowed me out now, carving its mark on her too. Together, reluctantly, we began to sift through the wreckage of his double life. Late nights in the garage turned into interrogations of the truck itself, as though the metal could speak if we pressed hard enough. We checked under the seats, inside the lining, even beneath the floor mats, uncovering small relics of his hidden world. Receipts from towns I had never visited, a matchbook with a name scrawled inside, a set of keys that opened nothing in our house. Each discovery was a sting, each object a shard of glass pressed deeper into already bleeding flesh. And yet I couldn't stop. Neither of us could. It wasn't closure we were searching for anymore. It was comprehension, a desperate attempt to rebuild a narrative from the ruins he had left us. But comprehension did not come easily. The more we uncovered, the less we understood, and the truck grew heavier with each revelation, as though the weight of his secrets was sinking it into the very ground. My nights became sleepless vigils, my days filled with questions I couldn't answer. The mistress became a constant presence, her grief a mirror to mine, her rage no softer, no weaker. Sometimes we screamed at each other, the echoes rattling the garage walls, and other times we sat in silence, broken but bound by the same man who had split himself between us. I hated her, I needed her, I pitied her, and in that tangle of contradictions I began to see the cruel truth. He had not only betrayed us, he had tied us together, unwilling companions in a journey neither of us wanted, and so the truck remained, its engine silent, its secret still half hidden, its frame carrying the weight of two women who had been forced to kneel before it, not in reverence, but in demand for answers. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside me raged on, relentless, unyielding, and as I looked at her across the shadowed garage, I knew this was far from over. The truck had more to reveal, and neither of us would leave until it had spoken its final truth. The fifth night after the photograph fell into my hands, after the ledgers and the storm and the uneasy alliance forged in the damp silence of my garage, I felt the weight of inevitability pressing against me. The truck was no longer simply an artifact of grief or betrayal. It had become a stage upon which the truth demanded to be performed in full. I could feel it in the stillness of the house, in the way the air seemed to hum with a tension I could neither name nor escape. That evening, the mistress returned once more, her hair tied back, her face pale but unflinching, and she carried with her something I hadn't expected. A small box, wooden, worn smooth by time, its lock already broken. She placed it on the hood of the truck with a care that bordered on reverence, and when I opened it, I found not jewels or letters, but a tangle of photographs, receipts, and scraps of paper, all evidence of a life carved in secret. There were images of him in towns I had never visited, with faces I did not know, and at the bottom of the box, a letter addressed not to me, not to her, but to a name I had never heard before. My heart pounded as I read the words in his unmistakable handwriting, confessing debts, obligations, and promises to someone entirely outside of our shattered triangle. It was not just betrayal of love, it was betrayal of truth itself. A labyrinth of lies that reached further than either of us had imagined. The discovery burned through the fragile alliance we had built, our voices rising in accusation and despair as the rain began once more outside. Drumming against the garage roof with the ferocity of an army, she accused me of having known, of having turned a blind eye to the cracks in his life, while I accused her of being complicit, of feeding the very double life that had now engulfed us both. The air grew thick with words we could not retract, the truck sitting between us like a silent judge, its metal glistening with condensation. I slammed the box shut, my hands trembling, my voice breaking into shards as I shouted that he had betrayed us both, that neither of us had truly known him, that we were clinging to the remnants of a man who had never fully existed. Her tears fell silently then, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. And for the first time, I saw her not as a rival, but as another victim, just as entangled, just as lost. Yet the rage did not leave me. It sat in my chest like a coal that refused to burn out, and in that fire, I felt both destruction and clarity. The climax arrived not with revelation, but with confrontation, raw and unforgiving. We decided to search deeper, to strip the truck of its layers, and as we pulled apart the lining beneath the seats, we found a hidden compartment, its edges rough, its contents wrapped in plastic. Inside lay documents that chilled me more than any whispered confession of love ever could. Forged contracts, evidence of financial dealings that hinted at crimes I could barely comprehend, names of men whose reputations were steeped in danger. He had not simply betrayed me as a husband. He had lived a life that could have destroyed us both if it had come to light. The mistress recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, and in that instant, the full weight of what we had uncovered pressed down on us like a crushing wave. This was not only the story of infidelity, it was the story of a man who had built his world upon shadows, and we were standing in the ruins. The truck had been his vault, his sanctuary, his accomplice, and now it had become our judge, forcing us to see truths we could not unsee. The rage inside me erupted. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel, the horn blaring into the night like a scream that belonged not only to me, but to every version of myself that had trusted him. I shouted until my throat tore, words spilling out in a torrent of grief and fury, and the mistress stood by, her own sobs mingling with the echoes of my pain. The storm outside seemed to answer us, thunder shaking the very foundations of the house, lightning illuminating the truck's frame in stark flashes of silver. In that violent communion of elements, it felt as though the world itself demanded we confront every lie, every omission, every stolen moment that had been hidden within those steel walls. I collapsed against the seat, my chest heaving, and for the first time since his death, I did not feel grief alone. I felt rage as a companion, a force that refused to release me, and in its cruel embrace, I found the strength to keep tearing at the fabric of his false life until nothing remained but the bare bones of truth. When the storm broke at last, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and oil, we sat together in silence, the document spread across the hood, the box of photographs open, the truck looming over us like a monument to ruin. My eyes burned with exhaustion, my hands raw from the search, but my spirit was unwilling to rest. She looked at me then, her eyes red but steady, and whispered that perhaps the truck was not his anymore, that perhaps it had never truly been his. It was ours now, not as a gift, not as an inheritance, but as a burden, a truth we were forced to carry because no one else could. I met her gaze, and for the first time I did not see an enemy. I saw the only person who understood the magnitude of what we had uncovered, the only person who could stand with me in this unbearable knowledge. And though my chest still ached with betrayal, though my heart still bled with rage, I knew she was right. The truck was no longer a relic of him. It was the vessel of everything he had tried to hide, and it was ours to confront, ours to dismantle, ours to survive. And so the climax of his secrets unfolded not in revelation alone, but in the shattering of illusions, the burning of grief into rage, and the fragile, uneasy bond forged between two women who had been betrayed by the same man in different ways. The truck had spoken its truth, cruel and unrelenting, and as dawn crept over the horizon, its light pale and unmerciful, I realized we stood at the edge of something even darker. The lies had been revealed, but the consequences had only just begun to rise. The morning after the storm, the house smelled of damp wood and stale coffee, but it wasn't the silence that kept me awake this time. It was the weight of the papers still spread across the garage, proof of a life so twisted that even grief seemed like a luxury compared to the dread they carried. I sat at the kitchen table staring at my hands, noticing how they trembled not with fragility, but with the raw pulse of urgency. The mistress arrived without calling, as though summoned by the same unease that had rooted itself in me. She entered quietly, her face pale and taut, and without a word, we went back to the garage, drawn there like moths to a flame that promised nothing but destruction. The truck stood waiting, its hood streaked with the stains of the storm, and I felt it then as more than a relic of betrayal. It was a door we hadn't fully opened yet, and behind it, shadows still lurked. We began again, rifling through the ledgers, tracing the names, the numbers, the signatures that seemed too carefully etched to be innocent, and the realization grew sharp and undeniable. Whatever he had been involved in, it was not just infidelity or secret debts. It was something that could swallow us whole if we weren't careful. We decided, almost without speaking, that the weight of this discovery couldn't rest on our shoulders alone. As much as I wanted to bury it, to seal the documents back into the compartments of that cursed truck, I knew that silence would only bind me further to his sins. We took the risk of driving into town, the mistress sitting beside me in the passenger seat where she had once sat with him, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The road stretched ahead, gray and slick with the remnants of rain, and with each mile my stomach tightened. We arrived at the police station just after noon, the fluorescent lights inside humming against the silence of our resolve. I placed the box on the counter, the photographs and papers inside rattling like bones, and when the officer behind the desk asked what it was, my voice broke but did not falter. Proof of what he was hiding. The mistress stood beside me, her presence both a wound and a shield, and for the first time I realized we were no longer two women divided by a man. We were allies bound by the wreckage he had left behind. The investigation began slowly, almost cautiously, as if the officers feared the truth as much as we did. They examined the ledgers, flipping through the pages with furrowed brows, exchanging glances that spoke of recognition and alarm. I watched their faces pale, their expressions harden, and I knew then that what we had uncovered wasn't just a private deception. It touched on something larger, something that had threads reaching into corners of the town I had never thought to question. When they asked us to step into an interview room, the walls bare and the air heavy, I felt the cold grip of exposure wrap around me. Every word I spoke, every memory I recalled of his late-night absences, his unexplained purchases, his sudden trips, felt like a piece of myself being carved out and placed on the table. The mistress added her own fragments, stories I didn't want to hear but had to let spill into the open. Whispered phone calls, sudden disappearances, promises he never explained. Together we built a picture of a man who was no longer simply my husband or her lover, but a figure tangled in dealings that had left scars far deeper than either of us alone had known. The more we revealed, the more the air thickened with threat. By the third visit to the station, whispers had spread. Glances lingered on us too long. And one night as I drove home from the store, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror that followed me for miles before vanishing into the dark. Fear curled tight in my stomach, but it wasn't fear for myself alone anymore. It was fear for her too, for the fragile alliance that was now the only thing keeping me upright. We met in the garage that night, the truck looming silent above us, and confessed the same dread. There were others who didn't want this truth to surface. Others who had something to lose in the revelations we were dragging into the light. For the first time since her arrival in my driveway, I felt her hand grip mine, firm and unshaking. And the gesture wasn't one of affection, but of survival. Still, survival came at a cost. One evening, as we sat with the officers reviewing yet another set of documents pulled from the storage unit, a man entered the station, his eyes cold and his words laced with venom. He accused us of fabricating evidence, of slandering the dead, of tarnishing reputations we couldn't possibly understand. His voice grew louder, the room buzzing with tension, until 2 officers escorted him out, but not before he turned back to us, his threat sharp and unmistakable. "You don't know what you're playing with. Drop it, or you'll regret it." His words followed me into my dreams, poisoning even my sleep, and I woke night after night with the echo of his voice in my ears. Yet even in fear, I felt something harden in me. I had already lost my husband, my illusions, the safety of ignorance. There was nothing left they could take that hadn't already been stolen. In the weeks that followed, the investigation deepened, and so did the fractures within me. The town whispered behind my back. Old friends avoided my eyes at the grocery store. Neighbors crossed the street rather than meet my gaze. It was as though his sins had painted themselves onto my skin, and no matter how loudly I screamed that I hadn't known, that I was just as betrayed as they were shocked, I could feel the judgment pressing against me like an invisible weight. The mistress bore the same scars, her presence beside me both a comfort and a reminder of how far we had fallen from the lives we thought we knew. We spent nights in the garage still, the truck now stripped of its compartments, its secrets laid bare, yet it remained there like a carcass that refused to be buried. We spoke less and less, words replaced by the sound of shuffling papers, the scratching of pens, the dull hum of exhaustion. And yet, beneath the silence, a bond grew sturdier, not friendship, not forgiveness, but a recognition that we were both fighting the same storm, and neither of us could do it alone. The confrontation reached its peak one night when the police returned to the house, their flashlights cutting across the driveway, their radios crackling with urgency. They had discovered more, names connected to crimes unsolved, money trails that led into darkness far beyond our reach. They warned us that the danger was no longer abstract, that those tied to these revelations would not hesitate to silence us if it meant protecting themselves. My heart pounded as I looked at the mistress, her face pale in the harsh light. And for a moment I wanted to retreat, to slam the door on all of it, to retreat into the comfort of grief, and let the truth rot in silence. But when I looked at the truck, at its scarred and weathered frame, I knew that retreat was no longer possible. I had inherited his lies whether I wanted them or not, and silence would only chain me to them forever. We pressed on, battered but unbroken, each discovery slicing us open further but also knitting us together in resilience. The mistress no longer felt like an intruder in my home, nor did I feel like a widow abandoned by fate alone. We were soldiers in a war we hadn't chosen, women stitched together by betrayal, survival, and the relentless demand of truth. And as the investigation spread, as whispers turned into confrontations and confrontations into threats, I realized that the climax of his lies was not just the revelations we uncovered, but the transformation they forced upon us. We were no longer defined by the man who had deceived us. We were defined by the choices we made in his aftermath, by the courage we clung to when the world tried to strip it away. The night finally came when the police loaded the truck onto a flatbed, its frame groaning as if protesting the separation. I stood in the driveway, rain misting the air once more, and felt a hollowness I couldn't name. The mistress stood beside me, silent, her arms crossed tight, and we both watched as the truck disappeared into the night. It was no longer ours, no longer his, no longer a vault of secrets. It had become evidence, stripped of intimacy, stripped of memory, claimed by the world as the final witness to his life of shadows. The house behind me felt heavier, darker, but in that moment, I understood something with brutal clarity. The truck's silence had ended, its truth spilled bare, and though we were left raw and shattered, we had survived it. And yet survival was not the end. It was only the beginning of something harsher, something lonelier, a life rebuilt not on illusions but on scars. The truck had carried us into the heart of his darkness, and though it was gone now, the echoes of what it revealed clung to me like smoke. I turned to the mistress then, her face half hidden in the dim light, and for the first time, I didn't see her as a rival, nor even as an ally. I saw her as the only other person alive who truly knew the weight of what had been uncovered, the only one who would carry it as long as I did. And though no forgiveness passed between us, no words of solace softened the air, the silence itself felt like recognition, like a vow that whatever came next, neither of us would ever forget what the truck had forced us to see. When the truck was taken away, chained onto the flatbed and hauled out into the dark, it felt as though the last tether to my old life had been cut. But instead of relief, I felt only the hollow ache of an ending that carried no peace. The driveway was empty, slick with rain, the air trembling with the echo of chains rattling against steel. And in that emptiness, I felt the enormity of what had been lost. Not just my husband, not just the illusions I had carried for decades, but even the fragments of certainty that grief had once offered me. The mistress stood at my side, her shoulders rigid, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the truck had vanished. And for a moment we seemed like statues carved out of the same stone, unmoving, unyielding, yet fractured by invisible cracks. The house behind me no longer felt like mine. The rooms heavy with shadows that whispered of secrets I had never known. And I realized that the man I had loved, had not left me a home but a ruin. Not a marriage, but a labyrinth of betrayals that had reshaped me into someone I could no longer recognize. And yet, standing there in the damp night, my breath heavy, my fists clenched, I felt a strange pulse of survival stir inside me, fragile but insistent, like the first flicker of flame inside wet wood. A reminder that even in ruin, something could still burn. In the days that followed, the town whispered louder, voices carrying across fences and store aisles, their words sharp enough to cut though they were never spoken to my face. I became the woman who hadn't known, the widow who had been deceived, the figure of pity and ridicule, and I carried their judgment like a cloak I hadn't chosen but couldn't take off. The mistress, too, bore the same scars. I saw it in the way people looked at her when we walked into the station together, in the silence that met her at the market, in the doors that quietly closed when she approached. We were pariahs, bound not by affection, but by exclusion, the two of us marked by a man who had scattered pieces of himself into too many lives and left them all to crumble. Yet within that exclusion grew a resilience I hadn't expected. We spoke little, but our silences became a language of their own, a recognition that we had both been forged in the same fire, tempered by the same truth. At night, when the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the stars burned indifferent above, I would sit on the porch and feel the ghost of him drifting through the house, and instead of weeping, I would whisper into the dark that his lies had not destroyed me. They had changed me, yes, hollowed me, scarred me, but I was still here. And in that persistence, in that raw defiance of erasure, I found the faint outline of redemption. The police came back one final time, not with papers or questions, but with answers. They told us the scope of his dealings, the breadth of his lies, the names of the men he had entangled himself with, and the consequences that would ripple outward for years. They told us of accounts hidden, debts unpaid, promises broken to people who had built their lives around them. It was a reckoning I hadn't asked for, but one I couldn't refuse. As I listened, my body rigid in the hard chair of the interview room, I felt the last threads of my marriage unravel fully, no longer shrouded in illusion, but laid bare as a tapestry of deceit. And yet, when the officers asked if I regretted bringing the evidence forward, if I wished I had stayed silent, my voice came steady, unyielding. No. He may have built his life on lies, but I won't carry them any longer. The mistress echoed me, her voice lower but just as firm, and in that moment, I understood that survival wasn't just enduring the weight of betrayal, it was refusing to be defined by it, refusing to let his sins become our inheritance. We walked out of the station together, the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, and though its light felt harsh against my skin, it also felt like a benediction, a reminder that even scorched earth can feel warmth again. Life did not return to normal. It could not when the foundation had been shattered beyond recognition. But slowly, painfully, something resembling a new beginning took shape. I cleared the house of his remnants, boxing up clothes that still smelled of him, dismantling the photographs that had once lined the walls like proof of a love that no longer existed. Each removal felt like tearing away another layer of skin, but beneath it, I found breath again, space again, a room that belonged to me alone. The mistress moved out of town, needing distance, needing to shed the shadows that clung too tightly here. And though we did not part as friends, we parted as something more complicated, as witnesses who had shared a truth too sharp to ever be forgotten. Sometimes she called, her voice strained but steady, and we spoke not of him, but of survival, of what it meant to keep living when the man who had once defined us had turned out to be a ghost dressed in flesh. And in those calls, in the unspoken acknowledgement of our scars, I felt the slow stitch of healing begin, not erasing the wound, but sealing it into the story of who I had become. And now, when I walk past the empty garage, its air carrying only the faint trace of oil and dust, I feel not the weight of loss but the breath of space. The truck is gone, the lies are gone, and though the ghosts of them still whisper at times, they no longer bind me. I light candles some evenings, not for him but for myself, for the woman who endured, for the woman who rose from the wreckage of betrayal and claimed her own story. My hands still shake sometimes. My sleep is still broken by dreams I cannot control. But when I wake into a life that is mine alone, and in that quiet, in that hard-earned solitude, I find a kind of redemption that is neither sweet nor easy, but honest. The kind of redemption that comes only from surviving what should have destroyed you. The truck may have carried his lies, but I carry the truth, and though it is heavy, it is mine. That is the end of his story, but it is only the beginning of mine. The silence that followed the removal of the truck did not come as relief, but as a new kind of weight, pressing itself into the walls of my house, into the corners of rooms I thought I knew. I would wake in the night and listen to the absence of tires against gravel, to the hollow where an engine once growled and coughed, and I would realize that absence itself has a sound, and it was louder than anything I had ever endured. I would sit at the table in the kitchen, the same table where papers had once been spread like confessions, and stare at the place where morning light used to fall across his face, where his laughter used to rise like steam off coffee, and feel not the tenderness of memory, but the sharp ache of being haunted by someone who was no longer entirely real to me. His presence had been rewritten, fractured, turned against itself, and every shadow of him that lingered in the house now asked questions I could never answer. Who had he been in truth? How much of what I remembered had been genuine? And how much had been staged so carefully that I never thought to look behind the curtain? The silence became a mirror, and in it I saw not just the man I had lost, but the woman who had believed in him, and she was harder to face than any ghost. The photographs haunted me most. Their edges curled, their colors faded, their images refusing to soften with time. I would sit with them in my lap, turning them over in my hands, tracing the outlines of smiles that no longer belonged to me, eyes that seemed to gaze at something I could never reach. I would ask myself whether joy could be counterfeit, whether the curve of his lips as he looked at me had been the same curve he offered her, whether every photograph was a kind of forgery now that I knew his duplicity. The mind becomes a cruel interrogator when betrayal plants itself inside it. Every memory becomes evidence, every moment suspect, every gesture a potential lie. I would recall evenings when his hand lingered on mine across the table, nights when his laughter filled the bedroom, mornings when his voice was soft with affection, and I would wonder if she had known him on those same days, if her hands had been on him hours before he smiled at me. The photographs no longer recorded history. They accused it. They demanded explanations I could never receive, and in their silent testimony, I felt the enormity of absence once more. The body remembers in ways the mind tries to forget. My hands trembled even when I wasn't afraid. My breath hitched when I tried to sleep. My chest carried a tightness as though grief had planted itself inside my ribs. I saw the marks of betrayal not only in the papers and the photographs, but in the deepened lines around my eyes, the weight that clung to my shoulders. The nights my skin prickled with unease as though the truth itself had seeped into my pores. I aged in weeks what should have taken years, and when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I sometimes did not recognize the woman who stared back at me. Yet even as my body carried the scars of what had been done, it also carried the resilience of what I had endured. My legs still held me upright when all I wanted was to collapse. My hands still turned the pages of documents that cut me with their truths. My lungs still drew breath even when grief tried to suffocate me. The body bore witness, yes, but it also testified to survival, and in its stubborn continuation, I began to see a kind of defiance that words alone could not capture. The world outside did not forgive easily. Neighbors looked at me with eyes full of pity or disdain. Whispers slid through the air as I passed, and even old friends, who once had known the warmth of my kitchen and the comfort of my presence, now avoided me as though betrayal were contagious, as though I had chosen it, welcomed it, carried it like a badge. The town became smaller, its streets narrower, its people strangers who carved new walls around me, and yet, in that social exile, I learned something fierce. The judgment of others is just another prison if you let it be, and I had already served enough sentences in silence. I began to walk those streets with my head held higher, not because I was proud of what had been uncovered, but because shame no longer served me. I had not written his lies, I had only inherited them, and though the inheritance was poison, I refused to let it dictate the measure of my worth. In the gaze of others, I found the crucible of transformation, and in their whispers, I heard only the brittle sound of ignorance. The mistress lingered at the edges of my days like a shadow I could not escape. And though at first I resented her presence, with time I came to see her differently. She carried wounds that mirrored mine, scars carved in places I could not see but could feel when she spoke. There were nights we sat in silence, the air thick with all the things we could never forgive. But within that silence, I recognized something startling. She was the only other person alive who truly understood the shape of my grief, the magnitude of betrayal that had hollowed me. I hated her, yes, for being the other, for sharing pieces of him I thought had belonged only to me. But I also pitied her, for she too had been deceived. She too had been handed illusions and told they were real. In her eyes, I saw not an enemy, but a mirror, reflecting back the pain of being bound to a man who had divided himself until nothing of him was whole. She became not a friend, but a witness, and sometimes a witness is more necessary than comfort. For in witnessing, we are reminded that our suffering is not madness, but truth. The truth itself became its own weight, heavier than grief, heavier even than betrayal. There is a paradox in truth. It shatters, it scorches, it leaves you raw and trembling, but it also frees you from the chains of illusion. I could no longer cling to fantasies of a marriage unmarred by deceit, but in losing those fantasies, I gained something bitter yet essential: the ability to stand in the clear light of reality. Lies are soft. They cradle you. They lull you into believing you are safe, but they rot the ground beneath your feet until one day it gives way. Truth is hard, jagged, unforgiving, but it is solid, and when you stand upon it, you know at last that the earth will not swallow you whole. I began to cherish even the sharpness of it, the sting of it, because in its sting there was no deception, no hidden hand guiding me toward ruin. It was mine to hold, mine to bleed from, mine to survive. And in surviving it, I began to reclaim not him, not the marriage, not the past, but myself. And so I came to the final realization, not in a single moment of clarity, but in the long, slow unfolding of days that no longer belonged to him. Life would continue, scarred but unbroken. The house that once echoed with his laughter became a place of solitude, the kitchen a room for my own meals, the bedroom a space for my own sleep, the garage an emptiness that belonged to me alone. The future did not stretch before me with promises of love or comfort. It stretched to something uncertain, fragile, but mine. Perhaps I would walk it alone. Perhaps I would one day let another walk beside me. But whatever came would be chosen by me, not stolen by lies. The scars would remain, yes, etched into my body, my mind, my heart. But scars are not only signs of injury. They are medals of survival, proof that what tried to destroy me did not succeed. I carry them openly now, not as shame but as testament. And when I look at the night sky, wide and indifferent, I no longer whisper his name. I whisper my own, and in the sound of it, I hear the truth that will guide me forward. I am still here.